In the remote hills of East Texas, where the pine forests meet endless plains, there once stood a series of camps that promised salvation to the damned. Between 1845 and 1881, over 300 souls entered these redemption camps, seeking forgiveness for their transgressions. Only a handful ever left alive. The survivors whispered accounts of purification rituals so extreme that death appeared merciful by relative scale. Federal investigators who finally penetrated these camps in 1881 discovered something far more horrifying than religious fanaticism: a secret cemetery containing the remains of nearly 200 victims, each bearing signs of prolonged torture. But what they found in the Damnation family's private ledgers would shake the very foundations of frontier justice and reveal a criminal enterprise so elaborate that it had operated undetected for over 3 decades. In 1845, Texas had just joined the Union as the 28th state after nearly a decade as an independent republic. The frontier was a vast, lawless expanse where desperate men and women fled from their pasts, seeking either redemption or ruin in equal measure. It was a land where a man's word was his bond, where justice often came at the end of a rope, and where religious fervor burned as hot as the summer sun. Rumors spread along the dusty trails connecting sparse settlements scattered across hundreds of miles of 3 brothers who offered something precious to the damned: immediate salvation through purification of the flesh. The Damnation family, preacher Malachi, evangelist Cornelius, and prophet Jebediah, had arrived in Texas from Arkansas in early 1845, carrying letters of recommendation from various Baptist and Methodist congregations across the South. Preacher Malachi Damnation stood 6 feet tall with penetrating gray eyes that seemed to look straight into a man's soul. His black hair was always perfectly groomed, and his voice possessed an otherworldly quality that could make hardened killers weep like children. At 35, he was the eldest and most charismatic of the 3 brothers, capable of delivering sermons that left audiences both terrified and exhilarated. Evangelist Cornelius, 2 years younger, possessed an uncanny ability to read the guilt written on a person's face. He could identify a man's specific sins with such accuracy that many believed he had supernatural powers. His thin frame and hollow cheeks gave him an aesthetic appearance that reinforced his reputation for spiritual insight. Cornelius specialized in what the brothers called confession extraction, getting sinners to reveal their darkest secrets. The youngest brother, prophet Jebediah, claimed to receive visions directly from the Almighty. At 28, he was built like a blacksmith with massive hands that he claimed were blessed with healing powers. His role was to oversee the physical aspects of purification, ensuring that each penitent received exactly the level of suffering their sins demanded. Together, they established a network of redemption camps along the most desolate stretches of East Texas, where the cypress swamps met the piney woods and civilization felt like a distant memory. The camps appeared modest from the outside, canvas shelters arranged in precise circles around rough wooden crosses, with a central fire pit where the brothers would preach to gatherings of desperate souls. The clientele was exactly what one would expect on the frontier: cowboys fleeing rustling charges, prostitutes seeking escape from brutal brothel owners, gamblers drowning in insurmountable debt, murderers running from vigilante justice, and deserters from both the Mexican War and various Indian conflicts. But the camps also attracted a surprising number of seemingly respectable citizens: merchants guilty of fraud, politicians fleeing corruption scandals, and even some legitimate seekers of spiritual guidance who had heard of the brothers' reputation. For miraculous transformations, the Damnation brothers preached a harsh gospel of immediate purification that resonated with the violent, unforgiving nature of frontier life. Sin must be burned away like chaff in the fire. Malachi would thunder, his voice echoing through the pines as flames danced across his angular face. The flesh must suffer, so the spirit can soar to eternal glory. There are no shortcuts to salvation, only the narrow path of pain that leads to paradise. Their reputation for producing miraculous transformations spread throughout Texas and into neighboring states. According to letters that appeared regularly in frontier newspapers, men entered the camps as hardened sinners and emerged as new creations, gentle as lambs, pure as mountain snow, ready to spread the gospel to the furthest corners of the earth. It was on a sweltering August night in 1847 that the first disturbing reports began to surface, though few paid attention at the time. A cattle driver named Samuel Hartwell had stumbled into the town of Marshall, Texas, barely alive and speaking in terrified whispers about what he had witnessed at a redemption camp near the mysterious waters of Caddo Lake. Hartwell's appearance was shocking to those who had known him before his spiritual journey. Once a robust man in his 30s, he now appeared gaunt and prematurely aged, his hair having turned completely white. His hands shook uncontrollably, and he would flinch violently at unexpected sounds. Most unsettling were his eyes. Once bright blue, they now held a hollow, haunted quality that suggested he had seen things no man should witness. His account came in fragments, told between fits of trembling and moments of catatonic silence that could last for hours. According to the local pastor who took him in, Hartwell would wake each night screaming about the pit of purification, and the screaming that never stopped. In his clearer moments, he spoke of arriving at the camp seeking forgiveness for killing a man in a saloon fight over a disputed card game. They said the pain would cleanse my soul, Hartwell whispered to Pastor William Matthews, his voice barely audible even in the silence of the church. Brother Malachi looked into my eyes and told me exactly what I had done. Not just the killing, but things I'd never told another living soul. He knew about the money I'd stolen from my mother before leaving Arkansas. He knew about the woman I'd left pregnant in New Orleans. He knew everything. According to Hartwell's account, the purification process began immediately upon arrival at the camp. New penitents were stripped of all possessions, including their clothes, and given rough burlap robes to wear. They were then required to confess not only the sin that had brought them to the camp, but every transgression they had ever committed, no matter how minor. Brother Cornelius would sit across from you with this ledger, Hartwell recalled, his voice taking on a monotone quality, as if reciting from memory. He'd write down everything you said, and if he suspected you were holding something back, Brother Jebediah would use his gifts to help you remember. Those hands of his, they could cause pain you couldn't imagine. This confession ritual might continue for days or even weeks, depending on the perceived honesty of the penitent. Only when the brothers were satisfied that every sin had been revealed would the physical purification begin. This started with a complete fast 7 days with nothing but water, during which the penitent was forced to dig their own grave as a symbol of their spiritual death. The starvation proved insignificant compared to what came next. Hartwell continued, his entire body beginning to shake as he recalled the memories. They called it the trial of fire. Beatings with leather whips that had metal fragments sewn into them. Each lash was supposed to represent a specific sin being scourged from your flesh. But it went on for hours, sometimes days. But the physical torture was only the beginning. Hartwell described ritualistic burials where penitents were placed in the graves they had dug and covered with dirt, leaving only their faces exposed. They would remain buried for varying lengths of time, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, while the brothers prayed over them and declared their spiritual death complete. Some never emerged from these earthen tombs, Hartwell whispered, his eyes wide with remembered terror. Brother Malachi would stand over the graves and declare them perfectly purified. But I saw their faces when they went under. There was no peace, only absolute terror. The most disturbing aspect of Hartwell's account was his description of those who didn't survive the purification process. According to him, the brothers maintained that death during purification was the ultimate blessing, proof that the individual had achieved such complete spiritual cleansing that God had called them directly to paradise. They had a special ceremony for the ones who died. Hartwell recalled, Brother Malachi would read from the Bible while Brother Jebediah covered the grave, and then they'd plant a wooden cross and add the person's name to what they called the roll of the redeemed. They said these souls were the lucky ones. They'd skipped purgatory entirely. Marshall's local law enforcement initially rejected Hartwell's story as the ravings of a man broken by guilt and frontier madness. After all, no one had come forward to report missing persons, and the Damnation brothers had impeccable credentials. They carried letters of recommendation from churches throughout Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, along with letters from grateful families whose loved ones had been transformed by their ministry. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a practical man who had seen his share of frontier violence, was particularly skeptical. The frontier is full of men running from something, he told Pastor Matthews. Sounds to me like Hartwell got religion the hard way and his mind snapped under the strain. These revival preachers can get pretty enthusiastic, but murder, that's a serious accusation to make without proof. Officials quietly abandoned the matter, and within a month Hartwell himself had disappeared. Some said he'd moved on to California. Others claimed he'd returned to Arkansas. Pastor Matthews suspected something more sinister, but without evidence, there was nothing he could do. The camps continued to operate without interference, their reputation for miraculous conversions growing with each passing season. But Hartwell's disappearance was just the beginning of a pattern that would emerge over the following decades. Through the passing months and years, the legend of the Damnation family's miraculous conversions spread throughout the South and beyond. They claimed to have saved over 1,000 souls, transforming the most hardened criminals into model citizens, who went forth to spread the gospel in the most dangerous corners of the frontier. Letters arrived regularly at newspapers throughout Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana, praising the brothers' work and describing profound spiritual transformations. The letters followed a remarkably consistent pattern. A desperate sinner would arrive at a redemption camp, undergo the purification process, and emerge as a completely new person. Within weeks of their transformation, they would feel called to missionary work in remote territories, California, Oregon, the Rocky Mountains, or deep into Indian territory. Their final letters to family members spoke of their overwhelming desire to bring salvation to the unreached, often requesting financial support for their evangelical missions. Yet, for those who looked closely, there were troubling patterns that suggested all was not as it seemed. The redemption camps moved frequently, never staying in one location for more than 6 months. The brothers explained this as following God's calling to reach new populations of sinners, but it made tracking their activities nearly impossible for law enforcement agencies that were already stretched thin across the vast frontier. More disturbing were the accounts of families who sent wayward sons or daughters to the camps only to receive letters months later informing them that their loved ones had been so transformed by the experience that they had felt called to missionary work in distant territories. These family members were never seen or heard from again, but the Damnation brothers always had explanations and often forged letters to account for their absence. Mrs. Elenina Westbrook of New Orleans became one of the first to question the brothers' claims when her son Thomas, a gambling addict with mounting debts, disappeared after entering a redemption camp near Shreveport in 1849. Initially, she received regular letters describing his spiritual transformation and growing desire to spread the gospel in California. The letters contained enough personal details to convince her of their authenticity, and Thomas even requested money to support his missionary work. At first I was overjoyed, Mrs. Westbrook would later tell investigators. Thomas had been heading down a dark path, and these letters suggested he had found salvation. But something about the handwriting bothered me. It looked like Thomas's writing, but there were subtle differences, the way he formed certain letters, the phrases he used. I began to suspect someone was copying his style. When Mrs. Westbrook hired a private investigator to locate her son in California, the results were deeply troubling. None of the churches or missions in the areas Thomas claimed to be working had any record of him. The addresses he provided in his letters were either non-existent or occupied by people who had never heard of Thomas Westbrook or his missionary work. Similar stories began to emerge from across the region. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, a traveling physician who had treated several survivors of the camps, began to notice a disturbing pattern in their symptoms. They exhibited signs of severe trauma. She would later testify before a federal tribunal. Not the peaceful countenance of the spiritually redeemed, but the hollow stare of those who had witnessed unspeakable horrors. The few survivors who did return to civilization were indeed changed men and women, but not in the way the brothers claimed. They spoke little, started at sudden noises, and seemed to carry a burden of knowledge too terrible to share. Most disturbing was their universal reluctance to discuss their time at the camps, as if bound by some unholy oath of silence. Dr. Thornton documented several cases that particularly troubled her. Jacob Miller, a former outlaw who had survived the purification process, displayed symptoms she had only seen in soldiers who had witnessed the worst atrocities of war. He would wake screaming about the pit and the ceremony of ascension, she noted in her journal. When pressed for details, he would only say that some forms of salvation came at too high a price. Another survivor, a woman named Sarah Colby, who had sought redemption after abandoning her children to pursue a life of prostitution, returned to her family, a broken shell of her former self. She would spend hours staring at nothing, her sister Mary reported. Sometimes she would whisper prayers, but they weren't normal prayers. She would ask God to forgive her for the things she had seen, not the things she had done. Perhaps most telling was the case of Reverend Peter Hawkins, a Methodist minister who had volunteered to observe the Damnation brothers' methods, with an eye toward incorporating their techniques into his own ministry. Hawkins had entered the camp as a spiritual mentor and observer, not as a penitent. Yet he emerged just as traumatized as any other survivor. There are forms of evil that masquerade as righteousness, Hawkins told Dr. Thornton during one of their sessions. I went seeking inspiration for my ministry and found something that shook my faith to its core. The brothers are not servants of God. They are something else entirely, something that uses our deepest spiritual needs as weapons against us. When pressed for specifics, Hawkins would only say that the true purpose of the camps had nothing to do with salvation and everything to do with exploitation of the most vulnerable members of society. He refused to elaborate, claiming that speaking the truth would only endanger others who might be tempted to investigate. The pattern of mysterious disappearances and traumatized survivors continued throughout the 1850s and into the 1860s, but the chaos of the Civil War provided perfect cover for the Damnation brothers' activities. With entire populations displaced and communication systems disrupted, it became even easier for people to vanish without explanation. However, the end of the war brought new challenges for the brothers and new opportunities for those seeking to expose their crimes. In the spring of 1879, nearly 15 years after the conflict's end, a young Texas Ranger named Captain James Morrison began investigating reports of missing persons throughout East Texas. Morrison proved a systematic investigator with a background in military intelligence, and he noticed something that others had missed: a pattern of disappearances that seemed to follow the movement of the redemption camps like a shadow across the frontier. Morrison had been assigned to the case after receiving a formal complaint from Senator Charles Whitman of Louisiana, whose nephew had disappeared after entering a damnation camp near the Texas border. Unlike previous investigations which had been conducted by local sheriffs with limited resources and jurisdiction, Morrison had the authority and funding to conduct a comprehensive multi-state investigation. "There's something here that doesn't add up," Morrison wrote in his initial report to Ranger headquarters in Austin. "I've documented over 60 missing persons cases in the past 3 years alone, all connected to these redemption camps. That's not counting the cases from earlier years or other states where records are incomplete." Morrison's investigation led him to interview dozens of families who had lost contact with relatives after they entered the camps. The stories were remarkably similar. Loved ones would seek redemption at a damnation camp. Correspondence would continue for several weeks, describing their spiritual transformation, then abruptly cease with a final letter explaining their calling to missionary work in remote locations. The ranger's doubts intensified when he attempted to verify these missionary claims. Letters sent to the addresses provided were invariably returned as undeliverable. Churches and missions in the territories where the converts had allegedly gone to serve had no record of their arrival. Most damning, Morrison discovered that several of the letters supposedly written by grateful families contained identical phrases and even identical grammatical errors. "Someone is manufacturing these letters," Morrison concluded in a confidential memo to his superior. "The question is whether we're dealing with fraud, kidnapping, or something worse." Morrison's crucial discovery occurred when he encountered a man named Tobias Fletcher in a tavern in Jefferson, Texas. Fletcher appeared intoxicated and incoherent, but his story was coherent enough to send chills down Morrison's spine. Fletcher claimed to have worked as a gravedigger and general laborer for the Damnation brothers for nearly 2 years in the mid-1870s. "I thought I was helping with the Lord's work," Fletcher whispered, his hands shaking as he reached for his bottle. "Brother Malachi told me I was blessed to assist in the purification of souls. But some of those graves weren't for show. Some stayed filled permanent. He'd pray over them and declare another soul saved for eternity. But I knew what was really buried down there." According to Fletcher, his duties included not only digging the symbolic graves used in purification rituals, but also disposing of the bodies of those who ascended during purification. The brothers maintained that these souls had achieved such complete spiritual cleansing that God had called them directly to paradise. But Fletcher had seen enough bodies to know the difference between natural death and murder. "The way Brother Jebediah would work with his hands," Fletcher continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "He claimed it was healing, but I saw what those hands could do. He could make a man suffer for days without killing him, drawing out every bit of information about family, money, property. Then, when they had everything they needed, he'd finish the job." Fletcher described a sophisticated operation that went far beyond simple murder. The brothers would extract detailed information about their victims' assets, family connections, and business dealings during the prolonged torture sessions. They would then use this information to forge correspondence with family members, often requesting money for fictional missionary work, while providing plausible explanations for why the missionary couldn't return home or meet in person. The money kept coming, Fletcher revealed. Families would send funds to support their loved ones' work spreading the gospel. The brothers had it set up so the money would be forwarded through multiple intermediaries, impossible to trace back to them. Some families kept sending money for years, never knowing their sons and daughters were dead and buried in unmarked graves. When Morrison pressed Fletcher for details about the location of these graves, the man's demeanor changed completely. Terror replaced drunken bravado, and he began looking around the tavern as if expecting the Damnation brothers to materialize from the shadows. "They got eyes everywhere," Fletcher stammered, suddenly much more sober than he had appeared moments before. "People who asked too many questions about the brothers. They got a way of disappearing too. I shouldn't have said nothing. God help me. I shouldn't have said nothing." Fletcher fled the tavern that night and was never seen again. Some said he headed for California. Others claimed he'd been found dead in the swamps near Caddo Lake. Morrison suspected the latter, but Fletcher had provided enough information to narrow his search to a specific area near the Louisiana border, where the brothers were reportedly operating their latest camp. The information Fletcher had provided was both valuable and deeply disturbing. Armed with this intelligence and a growing body of evidence, Morrison knew it was time to take decisive action. Assembled a small team of trusted rangers and set out for the region near Caddo Lake, where the Damnation family was reportedly operating their latest camp. Their passage led through some of the most remote and forbidding terrain in Texas. Dense forests where the canopy blocked out the sun, and cypress swamps that seemed to swallow sound itself. Morrison assembled 3 additional rangers for his team: Sergeant Bill Crawford, a grizzled veteran of the Indian Wars; Corporal Miguel Santos, a former vaquero with unmatched tracking skills; and Private David Thompson, a young man whose sharp eyes and steady nerves had earned him a reputation as an exceptional marksman. Each man had been chosen for his discretion as well as his skills. Morrison couldn't risk word of their investigation reaching the wrong ears. Upon approaching the region, Morrison's team began to notice disturbing signs that suggested something was fundamentally wrong with the region. The local wildlife seemed unusually scarce. Even the insects that normally plagued travelers in the humid East Texas climate were noticeably absent. The few settlers they encountered warned them away from the area, speaking of unholy ground and cursed soil where nothing would grow properly. "Ain't nothing natural about that place," warned an old trapper named Ezekiel Marsh, whom they encountered at a trading post near Marshall. "Been hunting these woods for 30 years, and I can tell you that land near the lake ain't right. Animals won't go near it, and the few that do come back changed, if they come back at all." Marsh's description of the area matched reports Morrison had gathered from other sources. Multiple witnesses described a section of forest where the trees grew in strange twisted patterns and where the normal sounds of wildlife fell silent. Some attributed this to Indian burial grounds or other supernatural causes, but Morrison suspected a more mundane explanation. The presence of large quantities of decomposing organic matter could certainly affect local ecosystems. The team made camp several miles from the reported location of the redemption site, planning to observe the Damnation brothers' activities before making any move. Morrison's strategy was to gather irrefutable evidence of criminal activity before confronting the brothers directly. He knew that their religious credentials and reputation for good works would make it difficult to convince a jury without overwhelming proof of wrongdoing. On their first night, the Rangers heard distant sounds that confirmed their worst suspicions. Carried on the night wind from the direction of the camp came the unmistakable sounds of human suffering, screaming, pleading, and what sounded like religious chanting in languages none of them recognized. It wasn't the cry of someone in physical pain, Morrison would later write in his official report. This was the sound of a soul in absolute torment, pleading for mercy that would never come. The worst part was how it would stop abruptly, then start again hours later, as if the suffering was being deliberately prolonged. The screaming continued intermittently throughout the night, sometimes accompanied by the sound of digging and what seemed to be some form of ritual ceremony. When dawn broke, Morrison and his men found the courage to conduct a preliminary reconnaissance of the area. What they discovered in the woods surrounding the camp would challenge everything they thought they knew about the scope of the Damnation family's crimes. Recent burial sites dotted the terrain like a macabre garden, far too many to be explained as symbolic elements of religious ritual. Morrison counted over 60 graves that seemed to have been dug within the past year alone, each marked with a simple wooden cross bearing only a number. But it was the smell that convinced Morrison they had found something genuinely horrific. Despite the brothers' apparent efforts to manage their burial ground, the unmistakable odor of decomposition hung heavy in the humid air. Private Thompson, who had served as a battlefield medic during the Indian conflicts, confirmed Morrison's suspicions. "That's the smell of a lot of bodies," Captain Thompson reported grimly. Fresh ones and old ones, too. Whatever's happening here, it's been going on for a long time. As the Rangers moved closer to the camp itself, they began to hear sounds that made their blood run cold. From the largest tent came the rhythmic sound of metal striking flesh, accompanied by a man's agonized screaming and what sounded like religious incantations. The voice delivering the incantations was calm, almost conversational, creating a horrifying contrast with the obvious suffering of the victim. Morrison realized they were witnessing an active torture session, probably part of the purification process Fletcher had described. The Ranger captain faced a terrible decision: intervene immediately and risk losing the evidence needed to expose the full scope of the brothers' crimes, or allow the torture to continue while they gathered intelligence. The decision was made for him when the screaming suddenly stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that was somehow even more disturbing than the sound of suffering. Morrison knew they had just witnessed a murder, and any hope of saving that particular victim was gone. Now their priority had to be gathering evidence and preventing future atrocities. Using hand signals, Morrison deployed his men around the perimeter of the camp. What they observed over the next several hours would provide the foundation for one of the most significant criminal prosecutions in frontier history. The brothers functioned with the precision of a well-established business, their activities following a precise schedule that suggested years of experience and refinement. What Morrison and his team witnessed during their surveillance would soon lead them deeper into the investigation, revealing layer after layer of criminal sophistication that defied everything they thought they knew about frontier crime. They documented a horrific routine that revealed the true nature of the Damnation brothers' operation. Every dawn commenced with what seemed to be a legitimate religious service, complete with hymn singing and Bible readings. New arrivals would participate in these services, probably believing they had found genuine spiritual guidance. But as the day progressed, the facade of religious devotion would gradually give way to something far more sinister. Private consultation sessions commenced, during which Brother Cornelius would extract detailed confessions from the penitents. These sessions often lasted for hours, and the Rangers could hear increasingly desperate pleading from inside the confession tent. Brother Cornelius has a gift for knowing exactly what people are hiding, Morrison noted in his surveillance log, but I'm beginning to suspect this divine insight comes from more earthly sources. Prolonged interrogation, combined with psychological manipulation, and probably torture. The brothers had perfected a system for extracting not only confessions, but detailed information about their victims' financial assets, family connections, and anything else that might prove profitable. They would use this information to craft convincing forged correspondence with family members, often continuing these fictional relationships for months or even years after the victim's death. Private Thompson, who had positioned himself closest to the camp, reported observing Brother Jebediah's healing sessions, which were actually torture sessions designed to break down the victim's resistance. "He's got a collection of tools that would make a Spanish Inquisitor proud," Thompson whispered during one of their nightly briefings. "And he knows exactly how to use them to cause maximum pain without killing too quickly." The most chilling element of the brothers' operation was its systematic nature. They had clearly developed their methods over many years, refining their techniques for extracting information, forging documents, and disposing of bodies. The camp Morrison's team was observing was obviously not their first. It showed all the signs of a well-established operation that had been repeated many times in many locations. During their second evening of observation, the Rangers witnessed what the brothers called a ceremony of ascension, their euphemism for murder. A penitent who had apparently undergone several days of torture was brought to the center of the camp, where Brother Malachi delivered a lengthy sermon about the blessing of spiritual purification. The victim, barely conscious and showing obvious signs of prolonged abuse, was then ceremonially released from earthly bonds by Brother Jebediah. "They're not killing in a fit of religious madness," Morrison wrote in his report. "This is cold, calculated murder performed with the precision of a business transaction. The religious elements are just window dressing, designed to provide psychological cover for the perpetrators and explain away the victim's disappearance. The ceremony concluded with the victim being buried in one of the numbered graves. Brother Malachi recorded the ascension in a leather-bound ledger. The Rangers realized they were witnessing the final step in a process that had probably been repeated hundreds of times over the past 3 decades. But Morrison's team also revealed evidence that the brothers' crimes extended far beyond simple murder for profit. Hidden in the woods surrounding the camp, they found what seemed to be a workshop where documents were forged and other criminal activities planned. The brothers had clearly been involved in everything from counterfeiting currency to fraud schemes that spanned multiple states. "We're not just dealing with serial killers," Morrison concluded after reviewing the evidence. "We're looking at one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history. These men have been using religion as a cover for every type of crime imaginable, and they've been doing it for decades." On their 3rd day of surveillance, Morrison's team witnessed something that forced them to abandon their observation post and take immediate action. A family consisting of 2 parents and their young children arrived at the camp seeking family purification for what seemed to be relatively minor moral infractions. The sight of children being led into the camp made it impossible for Morrison to wait any longer for backup or additional evidence. "I couldn't stand by and watch children become victims of these monsters," Morrison later explained to his superiors. "We had enough evidence to prove their guilt, and we had a duty to protect innocent life." Morrison's plan was to arrest the brothers during their evening service when all 3 would be together and relatively exposed. However, the Rangers quickly discovered that the Damnation family was far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The brothers had obviously planned for the possibility of law enforcement intervention and had prepared accordingly. When Morrison's team moved in to make the arrests, they found themselves facing not only the 3 brothers, but also several heavily armed accomplices who had been posing as camp workers. An extended firefight ensued that lasted nearly an hour and left 2 of the accomplices dead and Sergeant Crawford wounded. During the battle, the Rangers were horrified to discover that some of the camp's penitents had been so thoroughly broken by their torture that they actually tried to defend their tormentors. These victims, apparently suffering from what would later be recognized as a form of psychological conditioning, believed that attacking the brothers would result in their own damnation. "They begged us not to hurt their saviors," Private Thompson reported. "Some of them actually threw themselves between us and the brothers, convinced that we were agents of Satan, trying to prevent their purification. It was the most disturbing thing I've ever witnessed." The brothers themselves proved to be formidable opponents. Brother Malachi was an excellent marksman who had obviously seen combat before, while Brother Jebediah's massive size and strength made him dangerous even without weapons. Brother Cornelius, though physically less imposing, demonstrated an uncanny ability to manipulate people even in the midst of combat, using psychological tactics to confuse and demoralize the Rangers. The decisive moment arrived when Morrison managed to reach the tent where the brothers kept their records. Inside, he found not only detailed accounts of their crimes, but also evidence of their true identities. The Damnation name was an alias. The brothers were actually the Blackwood family wanted for murder and fraud in Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Everything about them was a lie. Morrison discovered their names, their religious credentials, their letters, all carefully crafted fiction designed to provide cover for their criminal activities. They weren't misguided religious fanatics. They were career criminals who had found the perfect disguise. Once their genuine identities were revealed and their records in the hands of law enforcement, the brothers' resistance began to crumble. One by one, they were taken into custody, though not before Brother Cornelius made a final attempt to escape by taking one of the child victims as a hostage. The standoff that followed revealed the true depth of the brothers' depravity. When Morrison attempted to negotiate for the child's release, Brother Cornelius calmly explained that the child had already been marked for purification, and that killing him would actually be an act of mercy. "You don't understand the service we provide," Brother Cornelius told Morrison with chilling calm. "These people come to us broken, sinful, worthless. We give their lives meaning by allowing them to participate in something greater than themselves. Death during purification is the highest honor we can bestow." It was Private Thompson who ended the standoff with a perfectly placed shot that wounded Brother Cornelius without harming the child. The remaining accomplices surrendered immediately, apparently recognizing that their cause was lost. With the immediate threat neutralized and the brothers finally in custody, Morrison's team could begin the grim task of uncovering the full scope of what they had stumbled upon. What they would discover in the hours and days that followed would exceed even their worst expectations, documenting the full scope of their crimes. Their discoveries within the camp and the surrounding area exceeded their worst expectations and provided evidence of criminal activity spanning over 3 decades. The brothers' record-keeping was meticulous and damning. Their ledgers contained detailed information about more than 400 victims, including names, backgrounds, methods of execution, and the amounts of money extracted from their families through fraudulent correspondence. The records showed that the brothers had been operating since at least 1843, 2 years before their arrival in Texas. They kept records like it was a business, Morrison reported. Each victim was assigned a number, and they tracked everything. How much money was stolen, what information was extracted, even which torture methods were most effective for different types of people. It's the most coldly methodical approach to murder I've ever encountered. The material evidence proved equally disturbing. Excavation of the numbered graves revealed the remains of nearly 200 individuals, most showing signs of prolonged torture before death. The victims ranged in age from teenagers to elderly individuals and included both men and women from all walks of life. Forensic examination of the remains conducted by Dr. Elizabeth Thornton and a team of medical experts brought in from Austin and New Orleans revealed the sophisticated nature of the brothers' torture methods. They had clearly studied human anatomy and psychology. Dr. Thornton reported their techniques were designed to maximize suffering while keeping victims alive as long as possible. Most unsettling was the discovery that the brothers had been experimenting with different methods of prolonged torture, apparently seeking to develop more effective interrogation techniques. Some victims showed signs of having been subjected to multiple different torture methods over extended periods, suggesting that their suffering had been used as a form of research. This wasn't just about extracting money or information. Morrison concluded, "I believe these men derived genuine pleasure from causing suffering. The religious framework provided justification for their sadistic impulses while also attracting a steady supply of vulnerable victims." The workshop Morrison's team had revealed yielded additional evidence of the brothers' criminal versatility. In addition to document forgery equipment, they found printing plates for counterfeit currency, stolen religious artifacts that had been modified for torture purposes, and detailed maps showing the locations of other camps the brothers had operated throughout the South. Most unsettling was the discovery of what seemed to be a training manual written by Brother Malachi detailing methods for identifying and exploiting vulnerable individuals. The manual included psychological profiles of different types of victims, techniques for gaining their trust, and step-by-step instructions for extracting maximum value from each person before their death. They had turned human exploitation into a science. Dr. Thornton observed after reviewing the manual, every aspect of their operation was calculated to maximize profit, while minimizing risk of detection. It's a level of systematic evil that defies comprehension. The scope of the brothers' network became clear when investigators examined their correspondence with accomplices in other states. The Damnation family had not been operating alone. They were part of a larger criminal organization that included forgers, con artists, and even some corrupt law enforcement officials who had been paid to look the other way. But the brothers' crimes extended far beyond what had been discovered at this single camp. As word of their arrest spread throughout the region, a flood of new information began pouring in from across the South, with information that revealed the true scope of the brothers' criminal enterprise. Letters arrived from across the South describing similar camps and suspicious disappearances dating back to the early 1840s. Mrs. Catherine Phillips of Moby, Alabama, wrote to authorities describing the disappearance of her husband in 1852, after he had attended a purification camp operated by three brothers who matched the description of the Damnations. Samuel received letters from our son for nearly 2 years after he left for the camp, she explained. The letters described his missionary work in California and requested money for his evangelical efforts. We sent over $800 before the letters stopped coming. Similar stories emerged from Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, and even Indian Territory. A pattern emerged of camps that would operate for 6 to 12 months in remote locations before moving on, leaving behind only vague stories of successful conversions and departed missionaries. The investigation revealed that the brothers had perfected a method of exploiting the poor communication systems of the frontier era. By operating in remote areas and constantly moving their base of operations, they had made it nearly impossible for law enforcement agencies to track their activities or connect disappearances across different jurisdictions. They understood better than most law enforcement officials how to exploit the weaknesses in our system, Morrison noted in his final report. They chose their locations carefully, targeting areas where local authorities were overwhelmed or corrupt, and they moved on before anyone could build a case against them. The brothers had also cultivated relationships with corrupt officials who provided them with advanced warning of investigations and helped them establish their false credentials. Several sheriffs, judges, and even some ministers were ultimately implicated in the conspiracy, having accepted bribes to provide letters or look the other way when suspicious activities were reported. The financial scope of the fraud was staggering. Investigators estimated that the brothers had extracted over $50,000 from victims' families through their fraudulent missionary correspondence scheme, an enormous sum for the time that represented the life savings of hundreds of families. But the psychological damage extended far beyond financial loss. Families across the South had spent years believing their loved ones were performing noble work, spreading the gospel, only to discover that they had been murdered within days or weeks of entering the camps. The revelation destroyed not only individual families, but entire communities that had taken pride in supporting what they believed was important missionary work. Growing evidence and public demand for justice meant that the legal proceedings against the Damnation brothers would become one of the most closely watched trials in frontier history, and quickly became one of the most sensational criminal proceedings readings in Texas history. Daily crowds filled the courthouse with spectators, reporters, and family members of victims who had traveled from across the South to witness justice. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Robert Maxwell, faced the challenging task of presenting evidence of crimes that had occurred over nearly 4 decades and across multiple states. The case was complicated by the fact that many potential witnesses had been murdered, and much of the evidence consisted of the brothers' own meticulous records. Members of the jury, Maxwell declared in his opening statement, "You are about to hear evidence of crimes so heinous, so systematically evil, that they challenge our fundamental beliefs about human nature. The defendants have masqueraded as servants of God, while serving only their own twisted desires for wealth and power." The defense strategy, led by prominent attorney James Worthington, attempted to portray the brothers as misguided religious zealots whose extreme methods had been motivated by genuine, if misplaced, spiritual fervor. Worthington argued that the brothers had genuinely believed they were saving souls, and that any deaths had been unintentional results of overly enthusiastic religious practices. "My clients are guilty of excessive zeal, perhaps even criminal negligence," Worthington argued. But they are not the cold-blooded killers the prosecution would have you believe. They are men who became so consumed with their mission to save souls that they lost sight of the limits of earthly authority. This defensive approach rapidly collapsed when the prosecution began presenting testimony from survivors and reading excerpts from the brothers' own records. The methodical nature of their crimes, the detailed financial tracking, and the evidence of systematic torture made it impossible to maintain the fiction of religious motivation. Brother Malachi's own testimony proved particularly damaging to the defense. Rather than showing remorse or claiming religious justification, he spoke with cold pride about the efficiency of their operation and their success in avoiding detection for so many years. We provided a service that society needed but was unwilling to acknowledge. Malachi testified with chilling calm. The frontier is full of broken individuals who have no purpose, no value, no hope. We gave their meaningless lives meaning by allowing them to contribute to something greater than themselves. When asked by the prosecution to explain the torture and murder, Malachi's response shocked even the experienced court reporters. Death is inevitable for all men. We simply made sure that these particular deaths served a useful purpose. The money we extracted supported important work that these individuals could never have accomplished on their own. Brother Cornelius proved equally unrepentant during his testimony. He described in detail his methods for extracting confessions and financial information, speaking as if he were explaining a successful business model rather than confessing to torture and murder. People want to confess, he explained matter-of-factly. They carry guilt that poisons their minds, and they're grateful for the opportunity to unburden themselves. My gift was simply knowing how to help them overcome their natural reluctance to tell the complete truth. Brother Jebediah's testimony was perhaps the most disturbing, as he described his torture methods with the enthusiasm of a craftsman discussing his trade. Pain is a teacher, he explained. It strips away pretense and reveals truth. My hands were blessed with the ability to apply exactly the right amount of pressure to achieve the desired result. The state's argument was strengthened by testimony from Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, who provided expert medical testimony about the victim's injuries and the sophisticated nature of the torture methods used. These men had clearly studied human anatomy and psychology. She testified their methods were designed to maximize suffering while keeping victims alive as long as possible. The work of experts, not religious fanatics. The most compelling evidence emerged from the handful of survivors who had lived through the brothers' purification process. These witnesses provided first-hand accounts of the torture, psychological manipulation, and systematic murder they had witnessed during their time in the camps. Samuel Hartwell, the cattle driver, whose 1847 testimony had first raised suspicions about the camps, was brought back to testify, despite his obvious psychological trauma. His description of the purification process provided the jury with a detailed understanding of how the brothers operated. They didn't just want to kill us, Hartwell testified, his voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. They wanted to break us completely first, body, mind, and spirit. The torture wasn't just about extracting information. They enjoyed watching us suffer. Other survivors corroborated Hartwell's account and provided additional details about the brothers' methods. Rebecca Marsh, a former prostitute who had survived 3 weeks in a camp, described how the brothers used psychological manipulation to break down their victims' resistance. They would tell you that your suffering was necessary for your salvation, she testified. They made you feel grateful for the torture, convinced you that you deserved it. By the time they were finished with you, you believed that dying would be a mercy, and that believing it would make you one of the blessed. Perhaps most disturbing was the testimony of Jacob Wheeler, a former accomplice who had helped the brothers with their forgery operations before developing a conscience and escaping. Wheeler provided insider details about the scope of the criminal enterprise and the brothers' long-term planning. They had it all mapped out, Wheeler testified. They knew exactly how long they could operate in each location before suspicion would build, and they had escape routes planned for every camp. They even had contingency plans for what to do if law enforcement got too close. Wheeler's testimony revealed that the brothers had been planning to expand their operations to California and Oregon, where the gold rush had created new populations of desperate individuals who might be vulnerable to their schemes. They saw the Western migration as a business opportunity, he explained. All those people heading west with money and no family connections to track them down if they disappeared. Among the trial's most startling revelations came when the prosecution revealed the brothers' true identities and criminal histories. Court records from Arkansas showed that the men calling themselves the Damnation family were actually Jacob Cornelius and Josiah Blackwood, brothers who had been wanted for murder and fraud since 1841. The Blackwood brothers had originally operated as confidence men in Little Rock, Arkansas, before graduating to more serious crimes. Their first known murder had occurred in 1842 when they killed a wealthy merchant who had discovered their fraudulent activities. Rather than face justice, they had fled west and assumed the identities of deceased ministers whose credentials they had stolen from a burned church. Everything about their religious personas was carefully constructed fiction, prosecutor Maxwell revealed to the stunned courtroom. They studied legitimate religious practices and terminology well enough to fool even experienced ministers. Their entire identity as the Damnation family was an elaborate disguise created to provide cover for their criminal activities. The revelation explained many of the inconsistencies that had troubled investigators over the years. The brothers' unusual interpretations of Christian doctrine, their reluctance to associate with other ministers, and their constant movement between locations all made sense when viewed as the behavior of criminals maintaining false identities. DNA evidence also revealed that one of the men calling himself Jebediah Damnation was not actually related to the other two brothers. Court records showed that Jebediah was actually Walter Grimm, a former soldier who had been discharged from the army for brutality toward prisoners during the Mexican War. Grimm had joined the Blackwood brothers sometime in the late 1840s and had proven so valuable to their operations that they included him in their assumed family identity. Following deliberations of under 3 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts for all three defendants. The evidence had been so overwhelming and the crime so heinous that there was no realistic possibility of acquittal. Judge Harrison Caldwell, a stern man who had presided over many frontier justice cases, delivered sentences that reflected the unprecedented nature of the crimes. "In my 30 years on the bench," he declared, "I have never encountered evil of such systematic, calculated nature. Your crimes represent not only murder and fraud, but an assault on the very foundations of civilized society." Jacob Blackwood, brother Malachi, was sentenced to death by hanging for 17 counts of first-degree murder. Cornelius Blackwood, brother Cornelius, received the same sentence for 12 counts of murder and numerous counts of fraud and torture. Walter Grimm, brother Jebediah, was sentenced to death for 23 counts of murder, making him responsible for more confirmed deaths than either of his partners. These executions were performed on November 15, 1882, before a crowd of over 2,000 spectators who had traveled from across Texas and the surrounding states to witness the executions. Standing before the hangman's noose, the three men showed no remorse for their crimes. Jacob Blackwood's final words were characteristic of the arrogance he had displayed throughout the trial. "We gave meaning to meaningless lives and purpose to purposeless deaths. History will vindicate our methods, even if contemporary society lacks the vision to understand them." Walter Grimm spoke last, and his final statement sent chills through the assembled crowd. "There are others like us out there. We were not unique. We were simply more successful than most. The frontier breeds predators, and there will always be those who know how to exploit the desperate and the damned." This investigation marked a watershed moment in frontier law enforcement, leading to new requirements for religious organizations operating in remote areas and increased cooperation between law enforcement agencies across state lines. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of isolated populations and the need for better communication systems to track criminal activity across jurisdictions. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton used her experience with the case to write one of the first comprehensive studies of criminal psychology, focusing on the methods used by systematic killers to identify and exploit vulnerable victims. Her work became a foundation for modern criminal profiling and victim advocacy programs. The financial impact of the brothers' crimes extended far beyond their immediate victims. Families across the South who had been sending money to support fictional missionary work found themselves financially ruined. Several communities that had taken pride in supporting what they believed was important evangelical work were left devastated by the revelation that their contributions had been funding murder and torture. Captain James Morrison was promoted to major and placed in charge of a new multi-state task force designed to investigate criminal organizations operating across state lines. His methodical approach to the Damnation investigation became a model for complex criminal investigations throughout the American West. The locations of these camps remained largely abandoned, avoided by locals who believed the ground itself had been cursed by the atrocities committed there. Even today, more than a century later, some of the remote areas of East Texas, where the Damnation family operated, are said to be haunted by the spirits of those who sought salvation and found only horror. The story of the Damnation family forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the potential for evil that exists within seemingly civilized society. Their crimes were made possible not only by their own depravity, but by a social system that failed to protect its most vulnerable members. The brothers succeeded for so long because they understood how to exploit the gaps in frontier society, the poor communication between jurisdictions, the reluctance to investigate the disappearance of social outcasts, and the general assumption that the religious activities were inherently benevolent. They turned society's best impulses, faith, hope, and the desire for redemption into weapons against the very people who most needed protection. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that the Damnation brothers were not aberrations or anomalies, but products of a system that created ideal conditions for their type of predatory behavior. The frontier's combination of isolation, desperation, and weak law enforcement created opportunities that were inevitably exploited by those willing to embrace absolute evil. Their story serves as a permanent reminder that evil often wears the mask of righteousness, and that the most dangerous predators are those who exploit our deepest spiritual needs as weapons against us. In the world where people seek meaning, purpose, and redemption, there will always be those ready to offer false salvation at the ultimate price. The Damnation family claimed to offer salvation to the damned, but in the end, they proved that some forms of damnation are far worse than any sin their victims had ever committed. Their legacy is written in unmarked graves scattered across the American frontier, a testament to the depths of human evil and the price of misplaced trust.